Welcome to another episode of Super Fast Corner. I'm your host, Kevin Mueller, and today we're going to be talking about tri-link suspension systems. So let's take a closer look at what we got here on the table. So you might recognize this. This is a PN chassis, and on the underside you can see we have a T-plate suspension system in the rear. And this used to serve us well back in the day when we were going a lot slower. Tires were not as grippy, engines weren't as powerful. But today we're going to need something a little bit more refined, a little bit better if you want to get the maximum out of your car. So we're going to put this aside and we'll get into a tri-linked suspension system. So here is our MR98 chassis with a tri-linked suspension system. And then you can see it's got 3 linkages, 2 on the side and 1 ball link in the center. And a tri-link suspension system is a lot better than the T-plate version, mainly because it's a lot smoother. The ball joint here allows the pod to rotate very smoothly in all directions, up and down, left and right, which gives you more consistency. And of course, in Mini Z racing, consistency wins you races. So you want to be as consistent as possible. Some other benefits of the tri-link suspension system is that the links on the outside are wide, so that they actually transfer the weight from the front of the car to the rear of the car quicker and better than in a T-bar setup. So this setup here will be a lot quicker, a lot more responsive, and a lot more consistent than a T-plate setup system. So let's talk about some building tips when building your tri-link suspension system. Whenever you first put it together, it is extremely important that your linkage is super smooth. So you want to make sure that you put it together without the engine on, without the suspension components on, and really just the plate underneath and the linkages together. And you want to make sure that that linkage is super smooth. I actually do what's called a fall test. So I put it to the side and make sure that the suspension twists, and then when I rotate it up, it should come flat. So this way I make sure that my suspension system is super smooth. You obviously want to check for any binding forward and backward. Okay, and you also want to make sure that the side linkages are smooth without any wiggle. So it's important, of course, because the linkages can be either too long or too short, that you get into a trouble where the pod in the rear can wiggle left and right. Now you notice this one, when I put some force on it, doesn't move at all. So that's built properly. You also want to mind this gap here. So if you have a linkage that might be shorter on one side than the other, then your pod will be twisted. So in that case, sometimes you just need to shim underneath one of the balls in front. That, of course, will make the arm slightly in an angle, which will make that arm shorter, so you can adjust it that way. Okay, and depending on the suspension system you have, for example here with the Atomic MRZ, you're going to want to either move this ball in or out to make sure that that linkage is nice and smooth. You want this gap to be perfectly parallel. So you want it to be parallel to the chassis, and that means that this ball joint is in the correct spot. Now, if this was too far out and pushing the motor pod away from the chassis, then it would be tilted like this. So with this lower bar connected, we'd have my pod tilted, and the gap would be getting larger and larger here. And then, of course, in order to snap it, I'm going to have to stretch this linkage. And then, of course, I'm going to have some binding left and right in my suspension, which, of course, is no good. The opposite can happen is if this connection is too close to the chassis. So if you screw it in too much, then what you're going to notice is that this gap is going to get smaller and smaller up here. And, of course, then this one is going to now push it out. And what's going to happen is it's going to become too loose, and the pod is going to shift left and right when you connect it. So you really got to take your time to shim the ball joint here to make sure that it's not either too far in or too far out when everything is connected together. So Okay, and then once again, there should be no play left or right. So when you take it in your fingers and try and move it like this, it shouldn't move at all. All right, so once you have it nicely built, it's really smooth, and of course then you can start adding the springs and the dampening to your suspension system. It's really important to dampen the tri-link suspension system, so you want to put grease in the side tubes if you have a setup here like the MRZ, or the grease in the actual shocks bodies themselves if you're using something like our MR98 chassis. So you want there to be grease. Now, one other common mistake a lot of people do with their setup is that they put way too much preload on the spring. So they turn these in way too much, and the spring is compressed way too much. They make it try and feel like an old T-plate system, and this doesn't allow the pod to rotate. The chassis isn't allowed to rotate properly in the rear, then what's simply going to happen is it's going to jack the inside rear tire. And as soon as that starts to happen, you lose grip. So you'll notice this right away. As soon as you're trying to get on throttle, you might even hear it make a weird engine sound. It won't be smooth, and it'll be very difficult. It might even jitter. You might see the rear end jumping as you try and get out of the turn. And, you know, that's a very difficult car to control. So in order to avoid that, make sure you have some play in your springs here. So as you notice here, I have not preloaded at all. So there's negative preload in this case because the spring can actually move. So I have a little bit of freeness in my pod before the spring actually starts to do some action. And this, of course, allows the the chassis, especially the rear of the chassis, to rotate and not lift my inside tire. It gives you a lot of rear grip. Of course, you can take it too far. If you completely unload these, so if I was to take this nut here and completely unscrew it, then there'd be way too much play in the rear, and what would end up happening is I get front tire lift. So when I push this down, the front inside tire would lift off the ground. Not obviously not bad because it will just push out on power, so it'll be easy to control, but of course it's not the fastest way around the track. So you want obviously all four tires to remain on the ground as you're driving through correctly. So if you don't allow the pod to rotate and it's very stiff, then what's going to happen is you're going to have some lifting of the inside tire around corners, and you're just not going to have as much grip as you possibly can with this kind of setup. So you want to have tiny little bit of play in your spring. So you can see that here in this one, but you can also see it here in the MRZ if we go to the side camera. Yeah, so if you're looking at this spring here, it also has a bit of play before the spring gets in contact with the actual plate here. So that's important as well. You want just a little bit of gap between or unpreloaded of the spring, and that will give you great rear traction as long as you have good dampening in the rear of your car. Last but not least, let's talk about how to balance out your rear pod. So the benefit of having a tri-link suspension system is that it's relatively easy to get your car to turn equally left and right, which is a little bit more hard with the old style T-plate versions that we used to run a long time ago. So you use the preloads here to adjust the balance of the car. So let's just give an example. If I'm turning to the left here, then the outside tire would be the right rear tire. And let's say in this case, our right rear tire is losing grip, so the car is oversteering and sliding out. And let's say if I make right-hand turns, then the left tire is the outside tire. And let's say it would have a lot of grip, so it would push out wide and the car wouldn't, get to the apex. Then what that means is that there's obviously an imbalance in the rear of the car, and we can simply fix that by adding or getting more roll to the outside tire. So in our design here, the MR98, it's this spring here that controls how much it rolls to that side. Okay, so when I'm going in a turn, sorry, I moved that the wrong way, it's going to roll this way in that turn, right? The spring over here will control that. So when I go into a left-hand turn,
So if I reduce the preload here, it's going to roll more, and it's going to give more grip to this tire. And then, of course, when I go into a right-hand turn, it's going to give less grip to that tire. So that should balance out my problem. Of course, I can also do it the opposite way, and I can give more preload on this side, which would then add more grip to the outside right tire and reduce the grip on the inside left tire. You do have to be very careful, though, because it all depends on the way that these shocks are oriented. In this case, the shock here is mounted onto the inside on the chassis and to the outside on the motor pod, which is different from the GL chassis. So on a GL chassis, you'll notice that the shocks are mounted on the motor pod itself, and then on the inside, and then on the outside they're attached to the chassis. So that makes them actually opposite of the MR98 and of the MRZ, the Atomic MRZ that's out there. So in this case, if you're going into a left-hand turn, this spring here is the one that's going to do the compressing, and you can see that. So it's this spring here that needs to be loosened in order to give more grip to the outside. So basically it's opposite. This tire here is being controlled by this spring, and this tire here is being controlled by that spring. So you just need to be mindful of what kind of suspension arrangement that you have, and which spring is actually controlling the roll to the outside tire in your corner. So last but not least, these old cars here, they had some simple tow bars in the front, which means you couldn't really adjust much. They were relatively balanced on either side. But nowadays, of course, we're all running with these new linkages in the front, and of course you have to adjust them. Now I tend to use a setup board to make sure I have correct tow in the front, because it is important for how your car tracks down the straightaway. So let's say, for example, you had some tow out on either corner, and let's say down the straightaway it was pulling to the right hand side. So on power, you're always pulling to the right, even though when you have it trimmed and you're going slow, it's tracking nice and straight. Well, then that usually means that this outside tire is towed out too much, and it's pulling the car to that side, or this tire here is towed in too much. So you can just either make an adjustment on either side. Either you can tow this one out more, or you can tow this tire in more, and that will help keep your car going nice and straight down the straightaway. So that's usually a simple fix for anybody who's having problems with down the straightaway, the car pulling to one side or to the other. Of course, that's only if you're trimmed straight. All right, so hopefully all these tips can get your car running smoothly and more predictably.
I hope that's everything that you need to know right now for tri-link suspension systems. Thanks for watching another episode of Super Fast Corner.